All right, this is Openstax U.S. History, Chapter 18, Section 3, Building Industrial America on the Back of Labor. So this time period, 1870 to 1900, is referred to as the Gilded Age. And for something to be gilded means that it's kind of like gold-plated. On the surface, it looks very valuable and rich. And of course, 18.2, we talked about how some of the richest people of all time made their fortunes in the Gilded Age in the United States: Carnegie, Rockefeller, Morgan, etc., etc. This time, we're going to look more underneath the surface. And the reason why this period was called the Gilded Age was because from the outside and on the surface, everything looked golden. But when you scratched it and looked at, kind of American society a little bit closer, you realize that things weren't all golden. And that was because a lot of this industrial production was built off the backs of specifically a working class who worked mostly in factories. We're talking about miners, railroad workers, textile workers, the people who made these things happen, whereas your Carnegies, your Rockefellers, they actually didn't do any of the work themselves. So in terms of what's going on in this particular period, we mentioned urbanization. This is the populations moving to the cities. And one of the reasons for that was because of the jobs that were there. Factories were the primary production facilities, so they were all in certain areas, so much so that during the course of the Gilded Age, different industries were pretty much dominant in different cities. Chicago was the meat industry or animal products. New York was associated with things like textiles, cloth, Pittsburgh, steel, etc., etc. So if you wanted to get a job, you had to go to the factories, you had to go to the cities where the factories were located. In the factories, workers were paid wages, typically very low, about as low as you could imagine. 10-hour work days, 6 days a week, so long work days. The factories were very, very, very dangerous. You could risk either injury or even death in many cases. There was really no protection for worker safety, right? No protections for safety. And very, very repetitive tasks, which had a certain psychological effect on people, right? Your job in a factory might be to just pull a lever or push a button for 10 hours a day, 6 days a week. So it was very mind-numbing in terms of these repetitive tasks. It more or less had made people themselves just nothing more than the actual machine. And a lot of this was done in the name of profit, right? That you don't, you require long days, you pay low wages, you don't care for worker safety because at the end of the day, it's all about money. And, safety equipment might cost money. You don't want to pay your workers more because that might cost money. And, profits were pretty much prioritized over human well-being. Businesses went so far as to establish specific sciences. Scientific management was essentially the practice of getting the most efficiency and profitability out of the factory. And so your work, the work schedule was really dictated by this. What was the most efficient? What was the most profitable? And as a consequence of, this desire for profit, it also meant that, every aspect of U.S. society was employed, including women and children, especially child labor increased dramatically in this period. One of the reasons was because women and children could be paid less. Right? That was one of the reasons. So it was very difficult, right, for workers, really no matter what industry you were in. Here's a photo of, not to mention the respiratory problems, dark, dingy. electric lighting and electricity made it so that factories could run 24 hours a day, 7 days a week. So there really was no end to the workday. And so workers began to organize and protest against these very harsh conditions. Unions were formed. Unions are organizations of workers. And usually they would try and improve working conditions, whether that was safer conditions or more pay or whatever it ended up being. Businesses, or one of the tactics that workers could do is to go on strike. And to go on strike is a refusal to work. And so as long as workers aren't working, the business is losing money, and it becomes somewhat of a standoff. The businesses might hire strike breakers. Strike breakers are workers hired really to counter a strike, right? So a bunch of workers decide they're going to go on strike because they want more money. Well, you could just hire somebody else, and that somebody else would be strike breakers. So that was a common tactic that was used by business. And so business and labor could go back and forth on these particular issues. However, workers struggled with unity, and there was a lot of different reasons as to why that is. Race was one, the inability for white and black workers to work together. Ethnicity, language, and culture. This is a period where there was a lot of immigration, specifically what we call new immigrants. And new immigrants tend to be from parts of Europe that you didn't historically have in the United States. So many Catholics, many people from Russia and Italy. This is a time period where 80% of the population of New York is foreign born. So to get a lot of different people from different cultural backgrounds, different ethnic backgrounds, who speak different languages and have different religious groups, it was just that proved the problem for the working class to come together, because essentially there's a strength in numbers. So, the workers' movement in the United States never is as strong as it could potentially be for this particular reason. But another problem that workers' unions weren't as influential or powerful was because there's still a widespread belief in individual work ethic, and that was the idea that you could go from rags to riches with hard work, that you didn't need organizations, you didn't need strikes, you didn't need protests, etc., etc. Some of these organizations in particular, now there were many unions and many organizations, some of them became infamous. The Molly Maguires were one of these workers' organizations that used more extreme tactics such as kidnaps and murder. So more extreme/violent tactics to improve their conditions. On the quote-unquote day of the rope, a number of Molly Maguires were executed for their role in the kidnappings and murders they committed in the name of trying to get improved working conditions. The Great Railroad Strike of 1877 was perhaps one of the largest and most widespread strikes during the Gilded Age. It was one of the very rare strikes in the Gilded Age, or really in American history, that had a wide geographic reach. And that was because you saw railroad workers in Pennsylvania, railroad workers in Indiana, railroad workers in Maryland. We're all kind of on the same page, and they all went on strike at the same time. In Pittsburgh in particular, it turned violent. You had over 40 people that were killed in Pittsburgh, but it eventually came to an end when the federal government intervened in that strike, and it was eventually put down, and order was restored, and those workers went back, but not after a lot of violence and damage that was created. So these efforts by workers to come together and organize could result in violence, and in some cases did take the intervention of the federal government, which is again Washington D.C., in order to to restore order essentially. Now workers continue to struggle while violence, kidnappings and murders were used. They weren't the most often. or most common forms of resistance. Instead, you had organizations that made various demands. So one of the very earliest ones, the National Labor Union, put forward the idea of the 8-hour workday. This was in the 1850s. It was much earlier, before the Civil War. The Panic of 1873 and the series of bank failures led to an economic depression. And usually when faced with depression, many businesses look to cut wages and lay off workers. You know, those who are affected by these panics the most are in some cases the workers themselves, who, you know, usually see this or usually experience this as, you know, losing their job essentially. And so in response to that, you had some of the most influential and important workers' unions formed during the Gilded Age. The first one was the Knights of Labor, which is described as one big union. Pretty much they said anyone can join. And the Knights of Labor had maybe more radical solutions. And the idea of being one big union meant that immigrants could join, white, black, women, men, skilled workers, unskilled workers, you know, kind of one big union for everybody. They were popular, but they weren't the most popular union during the Gilded Age. Instead, the AFL became the most popular. And one of the ways that workers' unions were discredited were with these violent affairs. The Haymarket Affair in particular, which took place in Chicago and involved a bomb being thrown at the police, which killed a number of people. And because you had this very chaotic episode in which people who were going on strike, these were radical, you know, unions, kind of like the Knights of Labor, because that violence had broken out, it really worked to discredit a lot of these labor unions. And in the aftermath of the Haymarket Affair, a lot of these unions were targeted of what they believed to be, you know, sort of these violent tactics. But the AFL was much more popular than the Knights of Labor in the long run. Its leader, Samuel Gompers, so Gompers is the leader of the AFL. As opposed to more radical solutions, the AFL wanted solutions that had a direct impact. You know, they didn't have, you know, their goals were very much small, sort of small steps at a time. Rather than allowing anybody to join, the AFL was exclusionary. They only included whites, they only included men, and they only included skilled workers. So by targeting a smaller portion of the population and targeting specific goals like those that had a direct impact, pay, safety, etc., membership of the AFL reached at a time 4 million people. So it was the largest and probably the most powerful labor union or organization of workers in the United States. Although there were many labor unions in the U.S. at the time, the Knights of Labor didn't. It was about maybe almost 1 million members, but by the 1880s and 1890s, the Knights of Labor was almost extinct, and the AFL instead was the more popular form. In the very late part of the 1890s, the workers and workers' movement suffered 2 defeats at 2 strikes. The Homestead Steel Strike in 1892 took place in Pennsylvania. This was Carnegie's steel plant. And when workers went on strike there, Carnegie hired Henry Frick and the Pinkerton detectives, which were like private security, to take the factory over from striking workers. Gunshots, violence broke out. This was another episode of violence that occurred. But by the end of what was, I believe, a 5-month strike, the workers ended up getting a defeat. The Pullman strike was over train cars. So once again, this was railroads. And because, you know, the Great Railroad Strike here of 1877, because that really had threatened to create a wide geographic reach, the Pullman strike in 1894 was especially worrying because what you had were railroad workers all over the country that if they saw a car with the Pullman name on it, and Pullman was the company, they were refusing to unload it because they were in solidarity with their workers who were on strike, I believe, in Indiana. Eugene V. Debs was the leader of the striking workers. But once again, like what had happened earlier in 1877 with the intervention of the federal government, the same thing happens 20 years later in 1894. Grover Cleveland, the president at the time, claimed the strike interfered with the U.S. Scroll down here. Post office, right? And because some of the train cars had mail on them, and there were strikers that were refusing to, unload these cars because of the strike, Grover Cleveland, who was the president at the time, claimed the strike had interfered with the U.S. Post Office, which is a federal offense and justified then sending in troops to put down strike, which is exactly what he did. So both Homestead and Pullman, both of these were strikes that ultimately led to defeats for the workers' movement.